One of the most important shifts in the 2024 election was the shift of young men who moved dramatically towards the GOP, the Republican Party, and Donald Trump. And it's important for us to understand why that happened. Why are young men becoming more conservative and more friendly to Donald Trump? Here to help answer that question is Richard Reeves. He's the president and founder of the American Institute for Boys and Men, and he's the author of the book of Boys and Men, a book that talks about the many problems facing young men and boys in our society. The suicide epidemic, which is mostly male, the drug overdose epidemic, which is mostly male, educational gaps that have opened up where men are not doing well in primary education or secondary education. There's a lot of ways in which men are struggling, and Richard Reeves is one of the most empathetic and incisive and insightful voices on that topic. And I talk with him today about the struggles of men and how they relate to this shift that we see politically among young men, especially. We talk about the media ecosystems that cause this shift, the policies that Democrats have ignored for quite a long time, and what it would take for Democrats to reverse this shift from young men. If you do enjoy the episode, you can support the New Liberal podcast by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism. Go to cnliberalism.org/become a member. You can join, you can support the podcast, support CNL, get access to bonus episodes of the podcast, get access to our Sticker of the Month Club. There's so much you can get by becoming a member of CNL, network with a local chapter. We would love to have you. One more time, thank you for listening and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me this episode is Richard Reeves. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jeremiah. Great to be here.
It's been a while since we chatted. We had you on a couple years back when you first released your book of Boys and Men, which was really an impactful book, I think, and it was one of my favorite books of that year. And I know that in the meantime, you set up this new kind of think tank, this new organization, however you want to describe it, the American Institute for Boys and Men. And obviously, this is the problems of boys and men in this country, and especially young men, have been something you've been thinking about very seriously for a number of years now. So I want to start off by kind of putting that in context of the big geopolitical event of the last few months, the American election. In the lead up to the 2024 election, were you concerned about kind of the intersection of those two things, about the direction that young men were going and the outcomes that young men are having, and how it was impacting their politics vis-a-vis the 2024 election? Is that something you have been thinking about for a while?
Yeah, it's something I've been thinking about and writing about. And I want to be clear that because I'm non-partisan, I wasn't concerned about it from the point of view of people voting the right way or the wrong way on the basis of a particular partisan perspective. But what I did feel was that there was a lack of a good substantive debate about what's happening with boys and men and how can we best help them. Because there was something of a performative masculinity on the right, if you like, leaning into, I think, some of these concerns that we might get into. But there was a deafening silence from the left. So there's a real missed opportunity to have a much needed debate about the facts around men, especially young men, as you say, and what we should be doing. And we could have had competing visions of how to address those problems, but we had nothing of the kind. And I was particularly disappointed that on the Democrat side, there was really no attempt at all to engage with or even to acknowledge the fact that there were some real issues facing boys and men. And so it was a weird outcome, in some ways very unexpected, that people went into the election perhaps thinking this was going to be more about women's rights and issues around women, but I think it actually ended up hinging much more on some of the issues of men, but in a very odd way, because as I said, there was a real asymmetry. There was just nothing being said on the left. And so that was frustrating as someone that's interested in policy and in substance, that there wasn't a substantive policy debate about how best should we help young men was not really a question that either side was answering.
Well, I know that you're more nonpartisan than I am. I am I am pretty open about where my loyalties lie, and as a liberal, and I was pretty concerned throughout the lead up to the election that one of the things that we saw was this kind of rise of an alternative media ecosystem, and it's the most cliche thing in the world now to say, oh well, social media is becoming even more important than traditional media. Like, we've been saying that for a decade, everybody knows that's true, but in particular we saw this kind of network of podcasts and live streamers and social media influencers who were overwhelmingly male, mostly young, and were appealing to young men. And again, I'll echo you and say it was very disappointing to me that Democrats made very little effort, I think, to reach out to this demographic. And I won't say they made no effort. There was some of that going on. But, this kind of podcast network, whether it's the Bussin' with the Boys podcast or the Nelk Boys or the Logan Paul or, the bigger ones like Joe Rogan and Lex Friedman and things like that, it seemed like that has basically become a Republican space. And that has, given how popular so many of these things are, that has real downward effects on kind of our national politics and the conversations that young men are having.
Yes, so I agree with you that you can be non-partisan and still lament a turn to reaction, whether that's of left or more likely right now to right. I do think that's what happened, was that more reactionary forces and voices were able to tap into this unmet need among a lot of young men just to be heard and seen. But you're right, there was also just a straightforward communications issue around this, which is meeting young men where they are. And I think that the decision not to engage, particularly with things like Joe Rogan, was, it was inexplicable to those of us who are in this space. And you just said that those podcasts, that sphere, which I spend a bit of time in now, has become a Republican space, but that's because Democrats allowed it to become that. There was no lack of opportunity to go into that space. And so what I've noticed happens is that Democrats or progressives don't go into those spaces, partly because they just don't perhaps quite, they don't pass the ultimate purity test perhaps, or whatever, for whatever reason. And so then they actually become more Republican spaces, more right-leaning spaces. And then Democrats can point to them and say, oh no, those are really right-leaning spaces, we don't go on there. And so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that they are Republican spaces. And then you get these absurd discussions now about we need a progressive Joe Rogan or whatever. And that's just crazy. These things happen organically. And it also, what happens is that these podcasts and even indeed the audiences for them sometimes are just written off as kind of just necessarily reactionary rather than engaged with. And I think that was a huge communications error. And it turns out particularly to have been important in terms of just failing to reach young men. And I will say one more thing, which this is a silly example, but one of the things I noticed was that when the Democrats published their economic opportunity strategy, someone actually alerted me to this when it came out. They said, look at the photographs of all of the voters that are featured in the document with Harris or Walz, and try and guess which demographic's missing. And so I went into this thinking, well, perhaps they don't have any young men, or they don't have any black men or any white men or something. But what I realized was that there were no men at all. And so it's quite an extraordinary thing to put out a document that manages to not represent half the voting bloc. And the reason I was really interested in that is not because I think very many people, perhaps with the exception of people like you and me, Jeremiah, actually download the economic opportunity agenda and decide how to vote.
What are you talking about? The farmers in Iowa are eagerly downloading PDFs, Richard.
Downloading. That's right. Who doesn't love a good PDF download in 2025? So I'm not suggesting that in itself was obviously a factor, but it was nonetheless rather extraordinary that document would have gotten out without somebody noticing that there wasn't a single man featured in it. And I think it's impossible to imagine that it would have happened the other way around. Can you imagine a document from the Democrats which featured only men and didn't have a single woman? It would be unthinkable because someone would notice. And so what's interesting about that is that nobody noticed. And that tells you something about the extent of the blind spot on the left, more generally, about the issues facing boys and men. They have failed and failed right up to the election to get past this idea that somehow this was an untouchable subject. And I think we saw the consequences of that failure.
Well, it's interesting to me because, we've been doing this series here on the podcast of like different things different ways in which the Democrats have failed. Basically, I talked with Will Marshall about how Democrats need to get back the working class because the Democrats have lost ground there. We did an episode on Democrats in the tech industry and where that went wrong. And with that, there's a lot of, there's at least a lot of thinking and theorizing and public recrimination and debate about like what could we have done better or like what caused this. But I think you're right in that this is more with Democrats losing young men seems more like a giant blind spot than anything else. And to the extent there's any debate, it's a debate about podcasts and do we need to do more podcasts rather than the issues themselves. And I'd almost phrase this in like in progressive language, if you want to use the language of like microaggressions or something like that. It's not my favorite thing to do, but we would certainly identify it as a microaggression if, say, you were of a certain demographic, a certain minority demographic, and you were in, say, a corporate environment, and just there's nobody there like you. And nobody ever looks like you, and nobody in the marketing materials, nobody looks like you, and people don't ever talk about issues that you think about, in the meetings. And, we would say like, oh, well, those are microaggressions against you. And it almost seems like we've come around to where like the Democratic Party is almost doing microaggressions against men, like they don't include men in their marketing materials, in their PDFs. They have an economic plan to empower women and all different kinds of minorities, but they totally ignore men. And like it feels a little silly to complain about this on one level, but also, it speaks like you said. I think there's just something's gone wrong because this is half the population.
Yeah. Well, you have to feel seen. We're used to saying that, and we've learned a lot. I think that people have to see themselves, but it's just that being inclusive shouldn't exclude men or even white men. In the name of inclusion, you shouldn't exclude anybody. But you did see that. And in fact, in that document I just referred to, and people could look at it, it's like there was one picture where it was in a factory, a warehouse or something. We did have a worker wearing a hard hat, and it was a pregnant woman. And I have no problem with that. But you can see how that thought process went, which is like, well, we're going to have someone in a factory with a hard hat. We can't have it be a man. God forbid a white man. So let's make it a pregnant woman. And to be fair to the Democrats, the calculation before the election was this is going to hinge a lot on women and women's votes. And we're going to run as the Women's Party. And we're going to assume that abortion in particular and many of these issues around women are going to play very hard. And in fact, some senior Democrats said to me privately, we know we're going to lose a lot of young men, but we are sure that we're going to pick up at least as many young women. And more importantly, that the women will turn out. The young men who are turning against us won't vote. The young women who are absolutely committed to us will vote. And so they were explicit about the fact that this was a strategy, right? We're going to double, and we don't want to do anything that could threaten our female vote or our claim to be the party of women. And that turned out to be a fatal political miscalculation. Young women actually swung a little bit Republican. And of course, abortion did not play such a big issue as people thought that it would. But it was a political miscalculation. I think the question is what happens now.
I also just think it's dangerous to become polarized in that way. Traditionally, I could be wrong here, but I'm pretty sure traditionally there's not been that much of a gap. If you go look at what it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 40 years ago, men and women have had some gaps in the past, but traditionally that they're not like, oh, there's a 40-point gap between how men and women are voting. And to me, it seems like societally dangerous in a way for there to be this big gender gap, that there's a male party and a female party. It seems like in a lot of ways, it's just going to be corrosive to the social fabric of society.
Yeah, especially when you have it in one generation. You're right. There's always been a gender gap, but nothing like as big as the gender gap we saw between young men and young women. And the fear here is that you become like South Korea, where you just have a gigantic political gap between young men and young women, which actually reflects a cultural disaffiliation in many ways of young men from young women. And we're actually about to publish some work showing that just a really big change in the share of young women, particularly saying that they want to have children compared to previous generations. And we'll see how that plays out. But I am worried that just culturally having this sense of not having shared interests between particularly young men and young women is a problem. And so it's not a good idea culturally. You don't want a women's party versus a men's party. And so the question, I think, is how the Democrats absorb the lessons of their defeat. And one of the problems with this polarized dynamic is a tendency to say, well, the reason why young men in particular voted for Donald Trump and J.D. Vance was because they've become reactionaries. They've become misogynists. They're turning against gender equality. They've watched too much Andrew Tate or whatever. And that's basically not true. There's no strong evidence for a decline in support for gender equality among young men. They were amazingly pro-choice. They just didn't vote on that. And so there's a huge danger here of a reaction on the left to the loss of those male votes, which is to effectively just blame the men and to say, well, that's just because they've become anti-women, they've become misogynist, etc. And you can find horrible examples online, of course, of genuinely misogynist content. And I'm not suggesting this is a problem among some of the leaders online and offline of some of the more reactionary forces, but it is a false application to then say, and that's why these young men voted for them. And if you start to believe that, you're in trouble politically.
Let me ask you a question about that. Because so you're saying that uh, young men have turned to the right, and we're going to talk about many of the reasons why this could have happened, right? There's different theories out there. One theory is that, well, they've just become more misogynistic due to Andrew Tate and a bunch of horrible influencers who are misogynistic. I don't think anybody would deny that Andrew Tate is misogynistic. But your theory is that number one, that's not true. The data doesn't show that men have turned against reproductive rights or anything like that. Are you concerned, though, that could be a consequence rather than a cause? That, men have turned to the right for some other reason, and now because of that, their commitment to reproductive rights or equality between the sexes or things like that it could degrade because they're going to become more conservative.
I think that's perfectly possible, especially if they move quite young to the right. But to some extent, again, I would kind of point the finger back towards the left and to the Democrats, which is to say, you can't allow that will only happen if young men in particular feel as if they have to choose between a party or a group or a side that they feel hears them, sees them, and represents them, or one that only represents women. Right? And in the end, in politics, usually something beats nothing. And if young men in particular feel that there's just essentially nothing there for them specifically on the left, then they will stay on the right. And over time, they may well become convinced, as you suggest, that actually one of the reasons the left doesn't care about them is because they have turned against men, they hate men, the feminists have won, the woke agenda, it's all of that. That starts to feel a bit more true. And so one of the things I find super frustrating about this is that if you have someone who makes this claim and Andrew Tate is a good example of someone who's made this claim, but he's not the only one, is boys and men are having some real problems right now. Number one. Number two, the powers that be, especially on the center left, are not paying any attention to those problems. And number three, that's because they hate men, they've turned against men, they've been overrun by woke feminists. And the trouble with that is that the first two statements are true. A lot of boys and men are struggling, and those problems have been hugely neglected by mainstream institutions. And if you get people that far through the argument, you can then say, and you know why? It's because they hate you, because they're a bunch of woke feminists. That starts to sound plausible. But the solution is not to blame the men who've been led to that point. It is to say, how did we let the claim from the right that we don't care about boys and men sound credible. They should sound crazy when they claim we don't care about boys and men. And we should be able to say, what are you talking about? The infrastructure bill helped working class men. We have this huge campaign to recruit male teachers. I've set up a whole task force on male suicide. Oh, what are you talking about? But the Democrats couldn't point to all of those things they were doing for men to make the claims they didn't care about men sound crazy, because they weren't doing those things for men. And so if you want the crazies to sound crazy, don't give them the ground that the Democrats gave them. And the way you do that is if you don't want them to claim plausibly that you're neglecting the problems of boys and men, the solution is simple. Don't neglect the problems of boys and men.
I really like that phrase you used earlier, that something beats nothing, because I don't think that, the podcast bro influencers are offering much substance in terms of what they're offering to young men, but they're there. They're not even necessarily having hard conversations about the male suicide epidemic or whatever, but they're just there. They're popular and they're talking about some things, and they're at least trying to get the audience. So something beats nothing. Um, if we don't think, though, that this turn to the right happened because of young men became more misogynistic, I'm curious why you think it did happen. We know that they're moving to the right, and we know some of the media that's involved. But I'm curious whether you see this. There's kind of a materialistic analysis where we can just say men are voting in their own interest because they want to vote against DEI programs or whatever. They want to vote for people who are going to help them materially. A lot of politics is based in this kind of materialist analysis, but other people kind of view it as a cultural thing. They like that Trump is macho and aggressive and boisterous in kind of a typically male way, and they don't like the Democrats have turned into the party of nags and scolds, and it's your mom telling you to eat your vegetables and don't say curse words. There's a lot of commentary about how Republicans used to be the one who scolded you for saying the wrong thing, in the 90s, and now it's Democrats who will scold you. I'm curious whether you think of this in cultural terms or materialist terms or some other terms that I'm not even getting into, because you think about the problems of young men more than anyone I'm aware of, and you think about them with more clarity and more seriousness. So how do you think about like the ultimate reasons why this has happened?
The way I think about this, and I might be accused here of trying to sort of have my cake and eat it, is that it's a little bit of both the material and the cultural, but that the causal arrow goes something like, if you're feeling economically insecure and pessimistic, you feel downwardly mobile, you feel like your own economic prospects aren't great, as a young man especially, and therefore your other prospects, marital prospects, etc., might also not be great. I think if that's your starting condition materially, that makes you much more open to a cultural claim that we are going to break the system to make it work for you, that the system is stacked against you in some way. That's why you're poor, and we're going to go break the system and lower taxes and have entrepreneurialism and all of that. So I don't think that populist claim would land as well among young men who felt great about their own economic prospects. And again, the failure to just acknowledge the reality of some of those changes, particularly for men, has been a huge failing on the left. So, for example, the last, I can say this to you, Jeremiah, not to many, but the last exciting paper from Raj Chetty's team at Harvard, Opportunity Insights, where I love nerding out with you, showed, and I wrote this up, and it was interesting that I don't think that they were encouraged to draw this finding out, but I did. It showed that among white men born into lower income, working class households, those born in 1992 were much worse off than those born in 1978, and the trend line seemed to continue to go down after that. So in other words, lower income, working class white men are poorer on they had 25 measures, and they'd gone down on 24 of the 25 measures. So those men are worse off than their fathers were on almost every measure. And I think if you don't think that's an important political fact to acknowledge and address, you're in real trouble. And so there's material aspect. But then, of course, what that leads to is this openness. So what happened was that young men's votes became up for grabs in a way that they previously weren't. They tended left in the past. So I think young men were just like, okay, I'm listening. They were up for grabs. And then the question became, who was most open to them? Who were they listening to? And in the end, they heard J.D. Vance on Theo Von, or they heard Trump on, or whatever. And they didn't hear anything from anybody on the left. And I'll say one more thing, which is, this is where it becomes cultural and a bit more about style. What they saw on the right was a bit of fun, a lot of freewheeling conversations, a lot of shooting the shit on podcasts, YMCA, we're going to Mars, survival of an assassination attempt, kind of etc. They just saw stuff on the right that resonated with them culturally, and that wouldn't necessarily have won if they didn't feel a bit gloomy about their prospects, or if there'd been a competing narrative on the left. And so what happened was they were just open and looking and deciding, and they saw the Republicans in their spaces. They saw some playfulness and some transgressive humor, and then they looked to the left and saw nothing. Or if at worst, maybe even a little bit of a blamey thing, where some scolding, to use your term, particularly from the Obamas towards the end of the election, and actually the signaling from the left towards young men for some time now, I'm afraid, has been, well, you don't have problems. You are the problem. And you can only do that to a generation for so long before you lose their votes.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. It goes back to the microaggressions thing where, and I am probably guilty of this in some instances where, it's been encouraged in liberal circles for a certain period of time to be like, oh, men are the worst, and you're a good male ally if you like give that men kind of response to things. But like that, I look back on that. I'm pretty sure I've done that a couple times, and I don't think that's a helpful thing to do. Even when I'm responding to things where like it's a real, some celebrity sexually harassed another celebrity, like that's a problem. But the correct solution is not to make men are the worst kind of a public message that you're giving.
Is that men? It's a sort of hashtag men are trash. I'll just say one thing on that, which is that, and I've done it. I've been doing it for longer than you, Jeremiah. And so I think we all have to own up to this a bit, but let's be really honest about this. If you're in a more progressive space and you're a man, you sometimes want to really go out of your way to make sure that everybody there, especially the women, yet knows that you're not one of those kinds of men, right?
Yeah.
You want to position yourself as an ally, one of the good guys, and so you'll go out of your way sometimes to make sure you never do or say anything that could possibly be interpreted as suggesting that you might think, oh, there's actually, some of the stuff that's being said on the podcast is kind of true, kind of right, and actually I'm really worried about men, and we should stop being horrible to men, and so on. So the incentives, the cultural incentives in sort of more progressive circles has been absolutely against men and speaking up, and in fact, it's rewarded the men who go to the greatest lengths to show what great allies they are and how different they are to the Andrew Tate misogynists on the right. And enough already. I think that we've got to own up as men to the fact that we've allowed that to happen to some extent, and then we wonder why men don't think we're speaking up for them, because we're not.
Well, and this would never happen with any other group. In progressive circles, it would never be acceptable for any other group, I guess other than white people, to just say, they're the worst, and the members of that group are supposed to agree with you. And it's just, I think you forget that, affinity politics works for minority populations. That's part of the Democratic playbook, but it works for majority populations too. It works in both directions. So you need to be aware of that, but not to get stuck. Like I'm aware that, being a white guy complaining that we're so rude to white guys is a losing battle to some extent. So I don't want to do that for the whole podcast.
No, but I will say, if you talk about class and race, I think that helps, because it's not that these things only break by class and race, but it is by and large kind of the lower income men and the men with less economic power that we should be worried about, which is not people like you and me by and large. And that's not to say that there aren't, problems for all groups, but I think it does help. But I just want to say one more thing on
Yeah,
this
sure.
individualization problem, because I think you're really onto something there, that it wouldn't be acceptable for other groups. And one of the things that I've kind of run into is that, say you're talking about the mental health problems of men, which are different to those of young women. People say, well, men won't seek help. Men won't go and get help. There's this whole meme about, I don't know if you've seen it, but men would rather do X than go to therapy. Have you seen this?
Yes, yes.
It's funny, to be fair, but do all that. So, well, men, what are you going to do? They won't seek help. They won't try. They won't get help. And what occurred to me is that I remember the whole debate about the fact that women were sometimes paid less because they didn't ask for a pay rise as much. Right? Women are much less likely to ask for a pay rise. And that was one of the reasons they weren't getting pay rises, because they were just less likely to go to their boss's office and say, give me more money. But the end result of that conversation wasn't, well, what are you going to do? If they don't ask for money, they're not going to get it, are they? Instead, what we did was we looked at the structures of pay. We looked at how people got pay rises. We looked at performance systems. We didn't end up blaming women for their failure to ask for a pay rise. What we did was we tried to change pay structure so that you didn't need to ask. So we actually reached out. So I use that as an example where it would be unthinkable to blame women for the fact they have less money because they just don't ask for more. But we do think it's okay to blame men for having mental health problems because they didn't go to the therapist, especially when it's quite hard for a lot of men to go to therapy. So I think as one example of that deeper point that you're making, which is that the left has become very comfortable with structural explanations for the problems of every group except men. And they individualize the problems of men in a way that they would never do for other groups. And that has run its course.
Yeah, and I mean, I fully agree. We could give examples of this kind of thing for the whole hour. But I do want to come back to one thing that you said earlier on, which was kind of the freewheeling, kind of fun nature of the media ecosystem. And I think this is such an important point because it's one of those things that's difficult to disentangle, where I think that part of what's happening here is that our cultural expectations of what is authentic have changed. It used to be that, if you were running for president, you want to appear presidential. You want to stand in front of an audience, and you're facing them, and it's a one-way communication. It's very formal. It's public. You're giving a scripted speech, right? And your goal is to have like sound bites and talking points. And now that just kind of comes off as stuffy and artificial a little bit. Rather than presidential, it's artificial. And now, what people like is, you're not standing, you're sitting. And you're having like this two-way conversation rather than talking at someone. Or maybe it's even 3 or 4-way on a podcast. And it's like informal and conversational and spontaneous. And that, I think part of what's happening here, media wise anyway, culturally, is just that kind of the male podcast space got there before the rest of us. They were early on this cultural trend. And like, that's hard to disentangle from the actual, legitimate problems of like men's actual problems in the real world. But part of this is just that I think, people like Joe Rogan and the other podcast people were very early to kind of recognize this shift, and they were the first ones to take advantage of it. And like Kamala Harris did some of this. I don't want to say that she did nothing. She went on Call Her Daddy. She went on there's Steven Jackson's NBA podcast. I forget the name. All the Smoke. So she did like a couple of these, but like the Trump team went like all in on this. The Trump team did dozens of podcasts and live streamers and like things like that. And I think just part of it is this: it's difficult to disentangle that they stumbled into the correct communication strategy as well. Independent of the actual gender issues.
Yeah, well, I don't think they stumbled into it. I think they knew exactly what they were doing and just decided to go for it. And they decided that it was worth the risk of making news if they said something rather than avoiding making news. And so historically it's been about don't make news, don't say anything. And now it's like, well,
For Trump, we know no attention is bad
the
attention
opposite.
for Donald Trump.
That's right. That's right. And that seems to be a bit of a political truth now. Chris Hayes, I think, has a new book out that's about the attention economy and how even negative attention drives positive attention, and vice versa. But yeah, I think so. It's interesting how many of these podcasts are actually run by former comedians or people who've done that, like Rogan, but also Theo Von is very popular among a lot of young men. He's a comedian too. And so there's a playfulness and a humor to it. That's one thing. And people do, I think, particularly young men, here I'll risk stereotyping, they're really drawn to humor, and that idea of it being quite funny, quite playful. And as I said, just freewheeling, shoot the shit type stuff. And that comes across as authentic compared to the scripted ones. But honestly, that's because it kind of is, right? If you do these things, if you go on these podcasts, and then you really do just have to get into the flow of it and sit, and you're just chatting, and it's like you're overhearing a real conversation, because you kind of are. And then you get a real sense of these people. Like anybody who can't understand why young men might have voted for Trump and Vance, they could listen to a number of these, but listen to JD Vance on Theo Von, for example. It's funny. He's talking about his kids. It's not very political, Jeremiah. I think that's part of it, right? The politics is very much second order to the personalities, and just the sense of like, yeah, this is an interesting guy. And what you're able to communicate through those mediums is warmth and playfulness and a bit of iconoclasm, a little bit of like, I don't think anyone's going to like me saying this. And I tell you what, Jeremiah, there was one moment in the podcast with Theo Von that JD did, that I thought was like, it was like the fourth wall. Am I getting my walls wrong? What is it when the fourth wall collapses?
No, yeah, you break down the fourth wall.
Yeah, it was like that. These are like the political equivalent of breaking down the fourth wall, because they started talking about drugs, and Theo Von said something about that, you can't even get cocaine anymore. You don't even know what's in it, and Vance said something like, maybe I should campaign on that, time, bring cocaine, real cocaine, time back again. And then he said, but I should probably wait until after the election before I start saying that. What do you think? This was before the election. He's been watched by millions of people, and he's saying to Theo Von, I'll probably wait until after the election before I start saying that. It was incredibly revealing moment, because you knew that everyone listening to him was like, well, he's not really going to do that. And it made it feel very different for him to even talk about something and say, yeah, I'll wait till after the election. So then you felt you were hearing a private conversation, and you were hearing the real JD, which took us you were.
There's a similar moment with Trump too, where look, it's not a secret that I am not a fan of Donald Trump, the person, but one of the most interesting exchanges that I've ever seen him have with anybody was with Theo Von, because Trump went on Theo's show, and Theo mentions at some point that like he used to be addicted to cocaine. Like this is part of Theo's backstory or whatever. Like a lot of, stand-up comedians probably. And Trump like actually leans forward. Trump, who's kind of famously a teetotaler, leans forward and is like, really? And Theo's like, yeah, like it, and Trump was like, how did it feel? And like, it's just really, it was really noticeable, because it's the only time, maybe ever, that I've seen Trump be like really interested in another human being, like leaning forward, eager to hear what someone else has to say. You don't get that out of Donald Trump ever. But when Theo Von's talking about like the rush of being high on really pure cocaine, and he's describing it to Donald Trump, like Donald Trump is riveted. And it's one of like, I don't know why that moment stands out so much to me, but like it's one of the most unique Trump moments. But I think that's the kind of thing you get on podcasts, and that and like you said, a lot of these are from traditionally male spaces. Stand-up comedy is traditionally a pretty male profession, and saying things that shock the system, has traditionally been something that male comics do. And a lot of the other podcasts have, they're very athlete heavy. Several of these are former professional athletes. So obviously another male space, but
yeah, I think it's something you get. You get that curiosity as well. You get that sort of, but I said it's like shooting the breeze, just freewheeling, and you don't know where the conversation's going to go. And I've done a few of these now, where the conversation's going to go, and it's quite funny, and it's quite revealing in the humor, and also when you are being personal around that stuff. And so I do think that it's caught something real, and as so often SNL have gotten to this much faster than a lot of other people. There's a couple of writers now at SNL who I think are just nailing it on the men's stuff. And so, have you seen this new one? It's called Medcast. It's a
Yes,
medical
yes.
appointment for men, right? It's brilliant.
Well, and this is another real thing. I think it's real. We could pull up some stats on this maybe, but I'm just going to trust my gut in a very male fashion, and say like
It's called Bro Science.
men don't like to go to the doctor. I bet if we looked up the formal statistics on this, men don't go to the doctor as often as women do. And this is not the therapy thing. This is just the stereotype of a guy's got a gash in his arm and he's like, it'll be fine, it'll heal up. But so continue though.
Yeah. Well, also, look, I can't resist, of course, saying at this point that the Affordable Care Act covers a well woman visit every year for women, but does not cover one for men. So I'm just going to put my policy hat on there for a moment and say, sure, maybe men wouldn't turn up anyway, but we've also baked into public policy that we cover an annual visit for women without cost, but we do not cover it for men. So I couldn't resist like just pointing out that we sometimes roll our eyes and say, oh, they don't go, but then we don't use policy necessarily to help them. But it's true, they don't go as much. And so what this skit does is it turns a medical visit into a podcast, and so it's the doctors like there saying, "Hey, how you doing? Just just chilling, just vibing," and then he says, "How are your stools?" And they kind of trick him into doing his blood pressure and like, "Yeah, you still party, right? Yeah, you still drink, yeah." And there's how many units of alcohol a week, and it's very funny. And the reason it really works, of course, is because it's exactly this thing we've just been talking about. What is it about that space, those podcast spaces, those vibes that's kind of really appealing to men, as well as to many women, by the way? I think a lot of women really enjoy it too, but it's quite male in the sense that it is shooting with shit. It is usually not face-to-face, kind of slightly an angle to each other. You're kicking stuff around. It's a bit transgressive. You're allowed to sort of transgress it. And so it's like a lot of men, myself included, kind of feel like, yeah, that's what it's like to kind of hang with your friends sometimes. And so it's a more appealing space to kind of a lot of men than it would be to perhaps the average woman. And that's not to say one is better than the other, but it's interesting that it's now very coded, very male. And it's incredibly important that we don't allow it to be coded right. But I'll tell you, I'm reliably informed that one of the reasons that the Harris campaign decided in the end for her not to go on Joe Rogan was that they'd looked at the transcripts of his previous podcasts and found some stuff they didn't like. And in the decision-making meeting, somebody said, we don't want to give him a platform. To which the obvious answer was, are you kidding me? We're asking him to give us a platform. We're not platforming him, we're asking to platform us. But what was so interesting was the sense that, of course, if you go through the transcripts of all of these interviews, of course you're going to find stuff you don't like. So what you do is you go on and you argue with them about it. Right, you have a discussion about it. You say, hey, Joe, I've got a bone to pick with you. You said this thing, I don't like that. And go with it. He'd love that. But it was this sort of purity test that was being applied to these podcasts, which of course they're not going to pass. So then you don't go on. And there, as I said earlier, then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, and I'm very in favor of this just in general. You need to go into enemy spaces, even if you just want to look at this in a tribal way. It's my team versus their team. Imagine if conservatives just decided, I won't write an op-ed in the New York Times because I think they're too liberal. Like, that's obviously not what conservatives do. Conservatives are happy to write in the New York Times anytime they get the chance to. And I think it's great when people like Pete Buttigieg, go on Fox News. Now he's got a reputation for being like the guy who goes on Fox News and does snappy comebacks and whatever. And that's great, as much as you can do that stuff.
But it's not just that, Jeremiah. It's that you allow them to, they're not, Joe Rogan's not an enemy space, right? He came out for Bernie. Let me put this differently. I don't think Joe Rogan for Democrats is an enemy space. I think that they've allowed it to be occupied by the enemy and basically annexed by the enemy by not going into it. I think that space is up for contest, and by basically benching themselves from those spaces, they then became flooded with Republicans. And it was after the Harris campaign decided not to go on Rogan that he decided to fill his podcast with Republicans for the final week of the campaign and then come out for Trump. But that was in no way preordained. And it is a fact of political life that you don't win spaces that you don't fight for. You don't win groups that you don't reach out to. And so to some extent, I see it as an abdication and a ceding of the ground. But actually, it connects to maybe some of the conversations you've had about tech as well. And you look back on some of these decisions that the Democrats have made to preemptively exclude people or to exclude themselves from those spaces. That has led to some downstream effects. So Rogan's one we just talked about, but the same, who knows if the world would have been different if Tesla had been invited to the famous White House summit on EVs, and if Biden had thanked Elon Musk for being able to get our astronauts up and down to orbit. I don't know, but I do know that that was something that was personally very wounding to Elon Musk. That's not a secret. It's out there. And so some of this does feel like really kind of self-inflicted wounds on the part of the Democrats, who actually just basically not by showing up or saying thank you, or just basically involving it. I do think that there's sometimes some responsibility for the loss of these people in these spaces just has to be brought home to the Democrats themselves.
One of the things that I think about when I think about this broader shift, it brings to mind another very broad shift that's also happening at the same time, and that is that there's an increasing amount of education polarization in this country. Increasingly, more and more Democrats are becoming the party of the educated elites, that if you graduate from college, you are more likely than not a Democrat. And certainly if you've got any sort of postgraduate education, master's or a med degree or a law degree or whatever, overwhelmingly likely to be a Democrat. And people who did not go to college or who work blue collar jobs are increasingly Republican. And this strikes me that there's potentially an interesting intersection there, because as you have extensively documented, men are struggling in education, young men are struggling, and colleges are becoming kind of a female institution. There's not very many men there.
Hmm. Yeah, so there's an overlap between the gender gap in education and the education gap in politics, in other words. And so, to some extent, one of the reasons that we're seeing this gender gap emerging, especially among younger people, is because of the education gap. So that's almost just mechanically true from a social science point of view. But when I've looked at the data, it doesn't go anywhere near explaining the shifts that we've seen in recent years, or the shift of young men, to the right. It can explain a small part of it, perhaps, but this does feel like it goes considerably beyond that. I think the fear I've got is that a sense of higher education as being not only more female, but as more progressive as a general set of institutions actually has a chilling effect on male college enrollment. It's striking now that most Republicans think that American higher education is bad for the country rather than good for the country. And I haven't seen a gender split, but I wouldn't be surprised if that wasn't more true among young men. And so this idea has taken hold that universities, colleges are not only predominantly female, but also, and partly relatedly, they're also very progressive spaces. And as a result of that, many men, perhaps particularly if they're conservative, white, rural area, take your pick, men just don't feel like those are maybe spaces that are going to be hospitable to them. And as I'm doing this work in higher education, it is very interesting that a lot of universities and colleges now are saying that some of the biggest challenges they have is with getting low-income white men to and through their institutions. And I think that's partly for educational reasons, but I'm really worried it's partly becoming cultural as well.
I also worry about the downstream effects of this whole thing happening, where if the Democratic Party is only pulling from, educated elites and people who've all gone to grad school, and those spaces become overwhelmingly, progressive and female and democratic, and there's just you create again this kind of polarization among multiple dimensions that means that you're not even going to see what you're missing. It's the blindness aspect that we talk about, where you're never going to be talking with rural blue collar men and understanding their perspective on things and understanding their concerns and what they actually worry about. you know Maybe you and I are both in this kind of grouping of like people who are very overeducated and who intellectualize everything, right, and love to debate high-minded theories, and maybe we would have a better idea of what's going on if you and I had more conversations with blue collar workers. It's probably something I need to do more. But if the entire party is structured that way, then I'm just worried that blindness will continue. That it will continue to be a blind spot.
Well, this is back to some of the previous conversations that we've had about class, and some of my previous work about the way in which particularly the liberal upper middle class is detaching itself from the rest of US society. My previous book, Dream Hoarders, was essentially a sort of long tirade about that and the political consequences of it too, and in particular the lack of respect that I think people end up feeling is being communicated to them. And like, it is just like, it's a basic fact that like men without a college degree are just worse off than men without a college degree were 40, 50 years ago. And now you can argue about the reasons for that and so on, but it's just that you can't have economic stagnation for such a massive group of people and that not have downstream effects. And so I do think that this bubble thing is a big part of it. I should say, just on a personal level, that I've actually moved to Northeast Tennessee. And so where I live now, it's 85% Republican. I live in Southern Appalachia, and I spend a lot of time talking to my neighbors and the people around me about how they're doing and testing policy ideas, etc. And I find that to be incredibly illuminating and useful in kind of testing some of my own presumptions. So it's any kind of bubble, Jeremiah, right? If a political party or movement ends up in a bubble where the groups or the people around you are so busy agreeing with each other, and in particular, perhaps rolling their eyes at the rest of the country, that eventually seeps down. It just does. And people start to feel, not without some cause, that they are being looked down on by a certain elite. And I think that that has been long in the coming. But now what's happening is it's being, to some extent, fused with some of these issues around gender. It's one of the reasons why Trump has gone in so hard around gender and DEI and stuff, is because that whole idea of progressivism being defined by some of the kind of extreme ideologies, which is sometimes known as, quote, woke, not a term I particularly like, but has actually just opened a huge door to Republicans who can very often actually just state pretty straightforward common sense positions and sound like they're the sensible ones. And I just am not quite sure how the Democrats allowed that to happen, but they did. And part of it's the reason you identify, which is a failure to look beyond the own bubble. I mean, I mentioned earlier that document without any men in it. It's unbelievable that you would produce such a document, and only possible if you're in an incredibly small and tightly defined bubble. So where that leads, I don't know, but I do think that the position of men, young men, and especially working class men of all races, is got to be part of this agenda. I don't think the Democrats dig themselves out of this hole without really acknowledging the need for a pro-male agenda. And that's going to be difficult. I think that I fear they'll draw the opposite conclusion from the last election results, but we'll see.
Well, I'd love to close, because we're coming up on time here. I'd love to close with talking about what that pro-male agenda might look like. And let me frame it for you this way. Let's say that, either in the run up to the 2026 midterms or even the 2028 election, that some candidate comes up to you and says, "I've been reading your work and I think it's great and I think you're right. This is a Democrat who's running for office. Maybe they're running for Senate in 2026, or maybe they're running for president in the primary. But they say, I want to know, I want to build a pro-male agenda. I want to attract male voters, and tell them that I care about them and tell them I care about the things they care about. What should I do? You're the expert, Mr. Richard Reeves. I want you to help me put together a pro-male agenda. What would you put on that? What do you think would be a good political message for the Democrats to try to reverse this trend that something they've ignored for too long?
I think given where we're starting from now, it would be a necessary first step to distance yourself from some of the rhetoric and ideological positions that have been taken by Democrats and progressives in recent years. And so I think you've got to start by saying that terms like toxic masculinity and need to go, and that we need to stop pathologizing men and blaming them for their problems, and just acknowledging some of the mistakes there. I do think that is now a necessary first step. It might not have been true before, but it is true now. And then say, by the way, this is not zero sum. When men flounder, it's hard for women to flourish, vice versa. And if you're a wife out there worried about your husband's job, or a mum worried about your son at school, or a sister worried about your brother's mental health, I just want you to know that we're here not only for you, but also for him. and him and him. Make it very clear that you're going to do both, that this is a rise together strategy. But then you pivot by saying, look, there are lots of problems for boys and men in our society, and we want to address them in just the same way that we want to address the ones for women and girls. So let's do something about the cratering share of male teachers, down from 33% to 23%. I am declaring a huge national push to get more men into our classrooms with scholarships, incentives, marketing campaigns, etc., so that we have representation in our classrooms. I am doing a huge push around male suicide. We cannot continue to lose 40,000 men every year to suicide and see a 30% increase among young men. That's why I've instructed CDC, etc., to work on specific programs that are going to help male suicide, and a massive push on vocational training, apprenticeships, technical high schools, etc., in our schools and through colleges, because it turns out that particularly boys and men do better from vocational investments. And lastly, continued investment in the infrastructure of this country, because the infrastructure bill was particularly good for working class men. And by the way, we see that as a feature, not a bug, and we're going to continue to create good jobs for working class men, many of whom have been really struggling in kind of recent years. And so you set out a combination of those sorts of policies, and then you say paid leave for dads as well as for women. Very Democrat policy, paid leave, but make sure it's for dads as well as for mums, because dads matter, period. I think you put a package together like that and you structure it in the right way. Teachers and coaches, a Coach for America program, fatherhood, paid leave, apprenticeships, etc. Many of which, by the way, are very compatible with Democrat policies more generally, and package that as an explicitly pro-male agenda. Then I think people will be listening. And I genuinely think that a Democrat who takes that and frames it the right way will be amazed at the lack of resistance they get from most women's groups, as long as they don't back away from women's causes too. Because the truth is, Jeremiah, that it's true. There are lots of problems for boys and men. And I think people, in the end, want Democrats to be telling the truth about what's happening to boys and men rather than looking away.
Well, I hope that some of the people who are going to be deciding this in the next couple of years are listening now. That sounds fantastic to me, and I hope we can make it happen. So
you heard it here first.
You heard it here first. Well, you heard it on, Richard has been talking about this stuff for a while, sure. But for the purposes of marketing, you heard it on this episode of the podcast first. It's the first time he's ever said it. So
it's the first time I've said it like that. So, and I will tell you that I had a couple of Democrat politicians in mind as I was saying that.
Well, there you go. I am excited for the possibilities. I hope we can make it happen. And I want to say thank you one more time to my guest today, Richard Reeves. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Jeremiah. That was fun.